The sun was a hammer on the anvil of the plains, beating the silence into a thin, shimmering sheet that covered everything. Caleb felt it most in the late afternoon, when the shadows of the porch posts stretched like long, thirsty fingers toward the horizon. His ranch was an island in a sea of swaying grass, a fortress of solitude he had built after the world had taken everything else. The house was too quiet. It had been for 5 years. The clatter of pans, the scent of baking bread, the low hum of a woman's voice. They were ghosts that haunted the stillness, memories he both craved and fought to keep at bay. The silence had become a companion, but it was a cruel one, and it was starving him in a way food never could. He had decided, in the cold clarity of a sleepless night, that the silence had to be broken, even if it was just by the sound of someone else's footsteps on the floorboards. He rode into Harmony Creek under the weight of that same sun, the dust of the main street coating his boots in a fine red powder. The town was a collection of weary, clapboard buildings that squinted in the glare. He went to the general store, a place that smelled of coffee beans, leather, and Mrs. Gable's sharp perfume. He'd posted a notice a week prior, written in his stiff, blocky script. Cook and housekeeper wanted. Board and fair wage. Inquire at Gable's Mercantile. He hadn't expected much. Maybe a widow down on her luck, or a young woman from back east who didn't know any better. He did not expect to find her. She stood near the back, by the sacks of flour, as if trying to blend in with the burlap. She was small, dressed in a pale pink prairie dress that seemed too delicate for this harsh land. Her black hair was neatly braided, but it was her face that held him. A fine silvery scar cut a delicate line from her temple to the corner of her mouth, pulling it into a permanent, subtle expression of sorrow. Other, older marks, faded to a pearly white, patterned the skin on her forearms, visible below her pushed-up sleeves. She held her hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on the floor. Mrs. Gable cleared her throat. "Caleb, this is Lynn. She's come about the position." Lynn looked up then, and her eyes were like dark, deep water, holding a history he couldn't begin to fathom. There was a flicker of fear in them, but beneath it, a resilience that reminded him of the stubborn prairie grass that always grew back after a fire. He saw the whispers ripple through the other patrons, the sideways glances, the tightening of mouths. He knew what they saw: a lone man and a foreign woman, a scandal waiting to happen. But Caleb saw something else. He saw the same quiet sorrow he carried in his own chest, worn on her skin instead of hidden behind his ribs. "Can you cook?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. She gave a single, sharp nod. "Can you work hard?" Another nod. He looked at her hands, slender but with calluses on the palms. "The ranch is a long way out. It's quiet." Her eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment the fear receded. "I like quiet," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet clear as a bell in the suddenly hushed store. The ride back to the ranch was a study in silence. Lynn sat straight on the horse he'd procured for her, her small bundle of belongings tied behind the saddle. She did not speak, her focus seemingly on the endless horizon, as if she were trying to memorize the shape of her new cage. Caleb respected her quiet, finding it a comfortable weight compared to the chattering emptiness he was used to. He led her into the house, the scent of dust and disuse greeting them at the door. He showed her the kitchen, the small bedroom off of it that would be hers, its window looking out onto the vast, empty east. He had expected questions, perhaps hesitation, but she simply took it all in with that unreadable expression, her scarred mouth set in a neutral line. "The well is out back. Firewood is stacked by the door. I take my meals at sunrise, midday, and sunset," he stated, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the space between them. She merely nodded, her gaze sweeping over the dusty countertops and the cold black stove. She untied her bundle, revealing a few articles of clothing, a worn wooden comb, and a small cloth-wrapped package. From it, she produced a set of gleaming cooking knives, their blades honed to a razor's edge. It was the first sign of the woman beneath the fear, a professional with her tools. That evening, for the first time in 5 years, the house filled with an aroma that was not of loneliness. It was a complex scent of ginger, star anise, and roasting meat, a fragrance that spoke of a world far from the sagebrush and dust of his own. He sat at his table, and she placed a bowl of steaming noodles and tender pork before him. It was unlike anything he had ever tasted. It was nourishing in a way that went beyond the body, a quiet offering of skill and care. He ate without a word, and when he was finished, he looked up at her where she stood by the stove, waiting. "Thank you," he said. The words felt inadequate. She gave her small, sharp nod again, but he thought he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a brief easing of the tension in her shoulders. The silence was broken. It had been replaced by the soft clink of her utensils, the gentle sizzle of food in a pan, the quiet rhythm of another life breathing within his walls. The house was no longer just a shelter. It was beginning, slowly, to feel like a home. The day settled into a routine, a silent dance choreographed by the rising and setting of the sun. Caleb would rise before dawn, the smell of coffee already a welcome ghost in the air. He would find a pot brewing on the stove and a plate of warm biscuits or savory rice porridge waiting on the table. He would eat, his eyes on the lightening sky, while Lynn moved with a quiet efficiency in the kitchen, her presence a soft, unobtrusive hum. He worked the ranch with a renewed vigor he hadn't felt in years. He mended fences that had been down for a season, cleared brush from the creek bed, and rode the long perimeter of his land, the taste of Lynn's cooking still a pleasant memory on his tongue. He found himself thinking of her during the long, hot afternoons. He pictured her hands, so delicate yet so capable, kneading dough or tending to the small herb garden she had started in a patch of earth behind the kitchen. She had coaxed green shoots from the unforgiving soil, tiny leaves of cilantro and mint that she used to transform his simple meals into something extraordinary. He began to notice the small changes she made to the house. A jar of wildflowers on the windowsill, the worn curtains washed and mended, hanging straight and clean, the floors scrubbed until the wood grain shone with a soft luster. She was polishing the tarnish from his life, and she did it all without a single word of complaint or request. He, in turn, began to leave things for her. A bolt of sturdy blue cotton he'd bought in town, laid on the kitchen table without comment. A new, sharper hoe for her garden. A thicker blanket for her bed as the nights began to hint at a distant autumn chill. These were their conversations, a language of gestures and unspoken acknowledgments. One evening, a sudden summer squall blew in, the sky turning a bruised purple. Rain lashed against the windows and thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the house. He came inside, soaked to the bone, to find Lynn standing rigid in the center of the kitchen, a shattered ceramic bowl at her feet. Her face was ashen, her eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the storm. Every clap of thunder made her flinch as if from a physical blow. He saw then that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging within her. He moved slowly, not wanting to startle her further. He knelt and began picking up the broken pieces. "It's just a storm," he said, his voice low and steady. "It'll pass." She didn't seem to hear him. Her breathing was shallow, her gaze fixed on some unseen horror from her past. He stood and gently took her arm to guide her to a chair. She recoiled at his touch, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. It was then her sleeve slid down, revealing a long, jagged scar on her upper arm, thicker and angrier than the others. It was the kind of mark left by a hot iron. The sight of it sent a cold fury through him. He dropped his hand immediately. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, the words a raw promise. "You're safe here, Lynn. I swear it." She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and the terror in her eyes slowly gave way to a fragile, flickering trust. The storm raged on outside, but inside the small, warm kitchen, something had shifted. A lock had been turned. A door, once bolted shut, had been nudged slightly ajar. The town of Harmony Creek had a long memory and a short supply of charity. Caleb's arrangement with the Chinese woman was the subject of endless speculation over Cracker Barrels and sewing circles. They saw sin where Caleb saw salvation. They saw impropriety where he saw a quiet sort of grace. When he rode in for supplies, the whispers followed him like his own shadow. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his vest, stopped him on the boardwalk. "Caleb," he began, his tone a mix of feigned concern and official warning, "folks are talking. It ain't right a man like you living out there alone with her." Caleb's hands tightened on his saddle horn. He looked at the sheriff, his face a granite mask. "She's my cook, Brody, nothing more." "Maybe," the sheriff allowed, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boot. "But appearances matter. And there's other talk, too. A man was in town last week, a Chinaman, asking questions, asking about a woman with a scar on her face. Said she was his wife. Said she ran away." A cold dread coiled in Caleb's stomach. He kept his expression neutral, his gaze unwavering. "Don't know anything about that." "He was a hard-looking man, Caleb," Brody pressed. "Had a mean look in his eye. Said he'd be back." Caleb just nodded, swung himself up onto his horse, and rode out of town, the sheriff's warning echoing in his ears. The peace of the ranch felt different when he returned. It was no longer a sanctuary, but a fragile bubble that could be burst at any moment. He watched Lynn as she worked, seeing the shadows under her eyes, the way she still flinched at loud noises. The scars on her skin were a map of her past, and he now knew the name of the man who had drawn them. The knowledge settled between them, unspoken but heavy. He began carrying his rifle with him when he did his chores, a precaution he hadn't taken in years. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rise in him, an emotion he thought had died with his wife. He was guarding more than his land now. He was guarding the fragile peace they had built, the quiet hope that had begun to take root in the barren soil of his heart. One evening, as she served him his dinner, her hand brushed against his as she set down the plate. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent a jolt through him. She pulled her hand back as if burned, her face flushing. For the first time, he saw not just a survivor, but a woman. The air thickened with a new kind of tension, one that had nothing to do with the man who might be coming for her. It was a tension born of loneliness and proximity, of shared silence and unspoken gratitude. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. The thought of losing her, of her being dragged back to the monster who had hurt her, was unbearable. He realized with a stunning, painful clarity that his quiet life was no longer enough. He wanted her in it. Not just her cooking or her cleaning, but her. He wanted to see the fear leave her eyes for good. He wanted to be the man who stood between her and the whole damn world. The fear arrived on a Tuesday, carried on the back of a tired-looking horse. Caleb saw him from the ridge where he was mending a fence line, a lone rider moving with a grim purpose toward the ranch. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, who it was. He urged his horse into a gallop, the wind whipping at his face, his mind racing. He had to get to the house first. He had to get to Lynn. He burst through the kitchen door to find her kneading dough, her hands coated in flour. She looked up, startled by his sudden entrance, her eyes questioning. "There's a rider coming," he said, his voice tight. "A man. I think he's the one the sheriff mentioned." All the color drained from her face. The fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered like glass. The terror he had seen during the storm returned, stark and absolute. She backed away from the table, her hands rising to her scarred cheek as if to hide herself. "Quan," she whispered, the name a poisoned dart. "Go to your room," Caleb ordered, his voice taking on a hard edge of command. "Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone but me." She hesitated for only a second before fleeing, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing in the kitchen. Caleb took a deep breath, his heart pounding against his ribs. He stood in the center of the room, unarmed but immovable, a bulwark of ordinary resolve. The rider dismounted, his boots crunching on the dry earth. The man who entered the kitchen was not large, but he carried an aura of coiled violence. His eyes were flat and cold, and they swept the room with a look of dismissive ownership. "I am looking for my wife," he said, his voice smooth but with a dangerous undercurrent. "I am told she is here." "There's no one here but me," Caleb replied, his stance solid, his gaze level. Quan smiled, a cruel, thin slash of a smile. "She is property. My property. I have a paper. She belongs to me." He took a step forward. Caleb didn't move. "She is a person. She doesn't belong to anyone." Quan's smile vanished. "You dare to stand in my way? You know nothing of our ways. She has dishonored me. She must be punished." He tried to push past Caleb, heading for the hallway where Lynn's room was. Caleb blocked him, placing a firm hand on the man's chest. The simple act of defiance was electric. Quan's face contorted with rage. "Get out of my way, old man." He swung a fist, but Caleb was ready. He was a rancher, his strength forged by years of hard labor. He deflected the blow and shoved Quan back with a force that sent him stumbling against the table. "Get off my land," Caleb said, his voice a low growl. "Now." Quan stared at him, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with hatred. He saw the unyielding determination in Caleb's face, the promise of a fight he might not win so easily. With a final venomous glare, Quan spat on the floor. "This is not over," he hissed. He turned and stormed out of the house, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and palpable menace in his wake. Caleb stood for a long time, his body trembling with adrenaline. He listened until the sound of hoofbeats faded into nothing. Only then did he walk to Lynn's door. He knocked softly. "Lynn, it's me." "He's gone." The sound of the bolt sliding back was hesitant, fragile. The door opened a crack and she peered out, her face pale and streaked with tears. Seeing it was him, she opened it fully and practically fell into his arms, her body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. He held her, his hands stroking her back, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was clumsy in his comfort, unpracticed, but he held on as if she were the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. He could feel the delicate bones of her shoulders, the frantic beat of her heart against his chest. He was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of emotion, anger at the man who had hurt her, relief that she was safe, and a deep, aching tenderness that took his breath away. He held her until the trembling subsided, until her breathing evened out into a quiet rhythm against his shirt. He led her to the kitchen table and sat her down, pouring her a glass of water from the bucket. He sat opposite her, their knees almost touching in the small space. The silence that fell was different from the ones that had come before. It was not empty or awkward. It was full, charged with everything that had just happened and everything that had been left unsaid for weeks. "He will not come back," Caleb said, the words a vow. "I will not let him." Lynn looked at her hands, which were twisting a loose thread on her apron. "He will not stop," she whispered. "He believes I am his to break." "Then he will have to break me first." The conviction in his voice made her look up. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for the truth of his words. She found it there, etched in the lines around his eyes, in the firm set of his jaw. She saw not a master, not a savior, but a partner, an equal. A man who saw her, the real her, beneath the scars and the fear. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why do you do this for me?" The question hung in the air, simple and profound. He could have given a dozen answers. Because it was the right thing to do? Because he despised men like Quan? But he chose the truth, the one that had been growing in the quiet corners of his heart. "Because the thought of this house without you in it," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "is more than I can bear." Her breath hitched. A single tear traced the path of the scar on her cheek. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping it away. His touch was hesitant, reverent. Her skin was so soft. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, a silent surrender, a granting of trust so absolute it made his chest ache. The space between them seemed to shrink, the air growing warm and thick. He saw the question in her eyes, a mirror of the one in his own. Slowly he leaned forward, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't move. She watched him, her lips slightly parted, her gaze locked with his. He closed the small distance between them and pressed his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of quiet revelation. It was tentative, gentle, a question and an answer all at once. It tasted of salt from her tears and the faint sweetness of the bread she had been making. It was a promise of safety, a declaration of feeling that transcended words. It was the end of loneliness. When he pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. The house was silent once more, but this time it was a peaceful, contented silence, filled not with ghosts, but with the promise of a shared future. The days that followed were softer, brighter. The unspoken tension had been replaced by a quiet intimacy that colored every shared glance, every brief touch. They talked more, filling the spaces once occupied by silence with stories of their pasts. He told her about his late wife, Mary, about the laughter that had once filled these rooms and the crushing quiet that had followed her death. He spoke of his grief, not as a wound that had healed, but as a scar of his own, one he had learned to live with. Lynn, in turn, spoke of her life before, of a village by a wide, muddy river, of parents who saw her as a commodity, and of the man they sold her to. She spoke of the crossing, the fear, the cruelty of a husband who believed love was about ownership and obedience was a wife's only virtue. She spoke of her escape, a desperate flight in the dead of night, with nothing but her knives and the clothes on her back. As she spoke, Caleb saw not a victim, but a warrior. Her scars were not marks of shame, but medals of survival. Her quietness was not weakness, but a shield she had used to protect the small, resilient flame of her spirit. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he wanted to spend the rest of his life tending to that flame, helping it grow into a warm and steady fire. The threat of Quan faded, replaced by the mundane and beautiful rhythms of building a life together. Caleb found himself smiling more, the expression feeling foreign but welcome on his face. He'd catch Lynn humming a soft, unfamiliar melody as she worked in her garden, and the sound was sweeter than any bird song. One afternoon he came upon her by the creek, her shoes off, her feet dipped in the cool, clear water. The hem of her light pink dress was damp, and the sun filtered through the cottonwood leaves, dappling her skin with light. She looked up as he approached, and a genuine, unguarded smile lit up her face. It transformed her, erasing the sorrow from her features and revealing a beauty that stole his breath. He sat on the bank beside her, their shoulders brushing. They watched the water flow over the smooth stones, a comfortable silence settling between them once more. "I never thought I would feel peace again," she said softly, her gaze on the rippling current. "I thought my life would be nothing but running and hiding." "You don't have to run any more," he said, taking her hand in his. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. He turned to face her, his expression serious. "Lynn," he began, his heart thudding a steady, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. "I know I'm not a young man, and this life is hard, but it's a good life, and it's better with you in it. It's more than better. You've brought this place back to life. You've brought me back to life." Her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Caleb, I don't want to face another sunrise without you," he said, the words coming straight from his soul. "Not as my cook, as my wife. Marry me, Lynn." The tears finally spilled over, tracing shining paths down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of joy. She didn't need words. She simply tightened her grip on his hand and leaned in to kiss him, a kiss that was no longer tentative, but sure, full of love and the promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. It was a kiss that said yes, a kiss that said forever, a kiss that said home. The wedding was as simple and honest as the life they planned to build. They rode into Harmony Creek not under a cloud of gossip, but under the clear, vast blue of the prairie sky. Caleb had sent word ahead to the preacher, a kind, elderly man who had always shown him a quiet respect. They met him in the small, sun-drenched church, the light filtering through the plain glass windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Lynn wore the blue cotton dress he had bought for her, the color of a twilight sky. She had woven a few wildflowers into her braid. To Caleb, she had never looked more beautiful. There were no guests save for Mrs. Gable from the Mercantile, who stood as their witness, her customary sour expression softened by a watery, surprised smile. The preacher's words were few but heartfelt, speaking of companionship, shelter from the storm, and the quiet courage of starting anew. When Caleb slid the simple gold band onto Lynn's finger, the one that had belonged to his mother, his hand was steady. He looked into his bride's eyes and saw not the fear and sorrow of the woman he had met in the store, but a deep, abiding love and a future that stretched out before them, as wide and full of promise as the land itself. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared, his voice echoing slightly in the empty church. The whole town might have been shocked, but within those four walls there was only a profound sense of rightness. The ride back to the ranch was different. They rode side by side, their horses moving at a leisurely pace, their hands clasped between them. The world looked the same endless grass, the same big sky, but everything felt new, burnished with a fresh coat of hope. When they reached the house, Caleb dismounted and lifted Lynn from her saddle, holding her for a moment longer than necessary, breathing in the scent of sun and wildflowers in her hair. He carried her over the threshold, a tradition he had once thought he would never perform again. The house greeted them not with silence, but with the quiet hum of a shared life. That evening they sat on the porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon in strokes of orange and purple. It was the same sunset Caleb had watched alone for 5 years, but now, with Lynn's head resting on his shoulder and her hand in his, it was a masterpiece. He was no longer just a lone rancher, and she was no longer a frightened refugee. They were two scarred people who had found in each other a place to heal. They were a family. The first stars began to prick the darkening sky, and a gentle breeze stirred the prairie grass. The world was vast and sometimes cruel, but here, on this small island of a ranch, they had built a sanctuary, a home, a love story written not in grand declarations, but in shared meals, quiet gestures, and the steadfast promise to face every sunrise together.